feel free. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about our class balance, and what we're going to do is we're going to give you guys a little bit more in-depth philosophy for some of the class balance stuff that we've been doing since the last Blizzcon. So something we've tried to focus on quite a bit recently is the alternate talent and gear specs. So we wanted to make sure that these talent specs that were not considered, I guess, mainstream, such as, let's say, the Shadow Priest or the Affliction Warlock, etc., we wanted to make sure that they were actually going to become viable in a lot of different elements of the game. So something we focused on a lot were these different specs, like Shadow Priest, Feral Druid, Protection Paladin, etc. We've also tried to emphasize a lot more itemization support for all these different specs. If you remember a couple of years ago, it was practically impossible to get any items that were oriented around these different talent specs. So we've gone to great lengths since then, trying to make sure that these different items would be available for these different specs, both through just straight boss drops, through PvP itemization, and also through the different kind of token systems we've been using in some of the in-game content. Another pretty major change we've made is the gear contribution for damage over time and healing over time spells. There was a time, the last couple of years, when those damage over time and healing over time abilities didn't scale very well in the end game. So they tend to get totally left in the dust by direct damage. And in addition, now what we've done is we kind of went with an approach where we were seeing players deliberately downrank what spell they were using, the rank of the spell they were using. While we're okay with this to some extent, it really violates one of the core philosophies that we have, which is that anytime you level up and you get a new rank of your spell, we really want you to be excited about that. That's supposed to be kind of a milestone for your character. It's supposed to be this cool event. Hey, I got a new rank, whatever, healing wave, or etc. So it really defeated that purpose for players to be finding that it was more effective to use older versions of the spell with all the spell bonuses that from your gear piled on top of it. So what we did with the expansion is we made sure that those older ranks of spells don't continue to scale up as well as the current ranks of spells. And finally, one of the major changes we made was that we increased health amounts substantially from level 60 to 70. Something we were realizing was the way our itemization works, we give you more stat points on an item if the item has stat points spent in many different types of stats. But what happened is we actually had a lot more different offensive stats than we had defensive stats. So as players got better and better gear, and that gear was more efficiently split among different stats, it inevitably had a lot more offense than it had stamina. So what we've done is we've not only increased the return that you get for spending a stat point on stamina on the items, but also we've tried to make sure to add other types of defensive stats like the resilience stat. That one to us has been very key as far as making sure that in PvP the combat times don't become too short. Nobody really finds it fun if they walk into an arena and it's a 5-on-5 and they just get instantly blown up. So that's something that we try to avoid. We try to make sure that the combat times are long enough to where it feels like players have enough time to react and make decisions, but not so long that you're just kind of trying to bore the guy to death. So some other general class philosophy that we have is something that Rob mentioned earlier. We're balancing World of Warcraft for a whole lot of different types of activity. We're not just balancing for one given type. And even though a lot of times players might focus in one area of the game, it's important to realize that World of Warcraft has a lot of different stuff going on. We have players soloing, we have players grouping for outdoor quests, we have players grouping for instances, we have small-scale group PvP, we have large-scale group PvP, we have raids, etc. So all these add to the complexity of balancing the different character classes. In addition, something that we've really shied away from doing is trying to have significantly different rules for the way spells and abilities work in PvE versus PvP. A lot of times players make suggestions that, hey, well, why don't you have the spells work differently in PvP than you do in PvE? And the reason is we really want the game to feel cohesive. It's important to us to feel like World of Warcraft is this cohesive whole, that you're playing World of Warcraft and your character plays very similarly in a raid instance or in a 5-man dungeon. You're pushing the same buttons and they have the same kind of effects as they do in PvP. We don't want suddenly the rules to totally change on you. In addition, one of our philosophies is that actually not every talent will be optimized for every aspect of the game. This is part of the talent system philosophy that we were discussing earlier, where We want the talent system to be a character differentiation system. We want players to have to make tough choices about their talent spec. And sometimes that actually involves, deciding what areas of the game they're going to focus on the most. Now, that being said, we do, in a lot of cases, try to make sure that talents, don't pigeonhole you too much into one single type of activity. There's some areas of the game where we need to, work on that some more. For example, not many people consider the protection warrior to be viable in PvP, and that's something that, something we'd like to resolve as much as possible. But that being said, we certainly don't expect to suddenly turn the protection warrior into this PvP juggernaut. But at the same time, we want them to be able to solo or grind effectively if they're trying to make a bunch of money. In addition, something that we found is that balance is ever changing, even without changes to the game. It's very interesting to watch sometimes that at times things that people perceive to be overpowered at one point in time can actually change very dramatically without us making substantial changes to it over time, just because players find counters to those strategies. So we're very leery to do what we call knee-jerking to a certain change. What we try to do is try to evaluate whether or not any given current balance problem in the game is something that we think might work itself out over time, or might diminish it over time, or in some cases it may even get worse over time. It might be something we have to step in and adjust very quickly. So that's kind of one of our philosophies, is to be very careful about the changes we make, because sometimes if we don't pay attention to this certain point, we will overcompensate dramatically. Finally, we have to be very leery of shocks to the system. Players play their characters, they get used to playing the game, and not everybody's kind of nerding out on the forums and watching what's going on, etc. So it's very important just to make sure that people don't log in and with every patch feel like they're suddenly playing a completely different character. So we have to be very careful of how any given change affects the way that class feels. Well, at this point I'm going to pass this on to Kevin Dorman, and he's going to talk about the individual characters, individual classes one at a time.
Hello everyone. I just want to take the next several minutes to kind of go over each class and touch on a few of the design challenges we've had to face since the last Blizzcon, which kind of places it between the after release but before Burning Crusade and some of the things that we've done since then. First item on the list here is the Druids. One of the things we noticed early on was that once the difficulty of dungeons got to a certain point, the warrior was the only class that could really reliably tank. And 1 out of 9 classes just wasn't enough to make decent 5-person groups. So what we tried to do was take bears in druid bear form and protection paladins and bring them up to the level of warriors, so that 3 of 9 classes would be able to tank. And beyond that, in the expansion of Death Knight would also be a tanking class, so 4 out of 10, to make sure the group composition was reasonably easy to achieve. And the same goes for cats in doing DPS. This actually ended up being the same spec for druids with the feral tree. And what we wanted to do here was make sure that he was doing competitive DPS to other DPS classes in raids and in groups. So it wasn't just a soloing spec. We also realized that the feral and the balance tree really didn't mix. We were kind of trying to push the moonkin form and cat form and bear form in those respective trees, but rarely would you go back and forth between the two. So we ended up shifting some talent from balance over to restoration, with the thought that most people would go either feral restoration or balance restoration, but not really mix too much of feral and balance. And it freed up a lot of talent points for druids. Which comes to the next point, which is at all times, the druid is a healer, and it was very prominent in release that he was primarily a healer. So we wanted to make sure that no matter what spec you were, that there were times you want to pop out and throw a heal. So we tried to introduce lots of talents that allowed you to be in cat form doing the thing, and then pop out and heal somebody if necessary, and be reasonably effective at it. Next up, the hunter. So one of the problems we found was that Feign Death was being used for pretty much everything the hunter needed to do. He used it for his threat way, used it for survivability, and also to place more traps in combat, which is kind of a side effect of being removed from combat. So we went with a decision to allow traps to be used in combat, and so you could use your Feign Death for what it was intended for, which was the threat way. And also at the same time, you got a lot more utility in groups and in raids, because you could throw multiple traps without having to worry about when you were going to Feign Death. Another big one is pet scaling. As you geared up in purples, you found your pet being less and less effective. So we